The Arctic Black Site Handbook, there are strange rules to follow. Welcome to DTC, the place of the brave, where we uncover the darkest secrets hidden in the most isolated places on Earth. Tonight, we're taking you deep into the frozen abyss of the Arctic, where an abandoned research station holds something far worse than the cold. A place where the rules aren't just for survival, but for containment. This is the Arctic Black Site Handbook, a set of instructions meant to keep the last crew alive, a warning for those who come next, and a prison for something that should never be set free. The lights will flicker, the radio will speak in voices you recognize, and when it knocks, don't answer. Subscribe to DTC, the place of the brave, for more stories from the edge of fear and survival. If you think you'd last a night at Erebus Station, think again. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what we uncover next, because some places are abandoned for a reason. I don't believe in superstition, never have. Ghost stories, bad omens, cursed places, just nonsense people tell themselves to explain the unexplainable. My name is Ethan Voss, and for the next 6 weeks, I'm stationed at Erebus Research Facility as a security officer, a routine assignment, or so I was told. Just a skeleton crew, scientists doing whatever it is they do, and me making sure nothing goes wrong. The moment I arrived, I knew something was off. The place looked abandoned, not just empty, but long deserted. The metal exterior was worn, dust clung to the glass panels, and the lights inside flickered weakly like they were barely holding on. No one came to greet me, no voices, no movement. I stepped inside. The air was stale, heavy with something I couldn't quite name, papers scattered across the floor, chairs overturned, half-eaten meals left to rot. Whatever happened here, it happened fast, and now I was standing in the middle of it, alone. I stood in the dimly lit corridor of Erebus Research Facility, staring at the mess left behind, papers scattered across the floor, overturned chairs, and cold, untouched meals. The station was abandoned, but not in the way I expected, not in a planned way. Something happened here, something fast. The silence was thick, pressing down on me. I had a job to do, assess the situation, report back, and survive 6 weeks in this forsaken place. The thought made me exhale a humorless laugh. I made my way to what looked like the security office. Dust had settled over the desk. The monitor hummed faintly, but the system was inactive. I swept my flashlight across the space, catching the glint of something on the desk. A notebook. I picked it up. Its black leather cover was worn, the edges frayed from use. Embossed in faded gold letters were the words, Erebus Station Operational Manual, Night Shift Protocols. A handbook, not unusual. I flipped through the first few pages, expecting dry safety procedures and maintenance instructions. I was half right. The opening chapters contained standard security guidelines, emergency shutdown protocols, restricted access areas, radio frequencies, the usual. Then the rules changed. After 2,200 hours, do not open any windows or exterior doors under any circumstances. If you hear knocking after midnight, ignore it. There is nothing outside. At 2 a.m., if you hear footsteps in the hall, do not leave your room. Do not look through the door gap. Never turn off the floodlights outside. They are not for your convenience. If the station radio turns on between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., do not respond. It will sound like someone you know. It is not. If you wake up and see someone standing at the foot of your bed, do not move. Do not look directly at them. A final note scrawled hastily at the bottom in shaky handwriting. Follow the rules. They know when you don't. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. What the hell was this? I read the list again, slower this time, as if I had misunderstood, as if my brain needed a second chance to rationalize it. This had to be some kind of joke, some kind of initiation ritual for newcomers. But the way it was written, this wasn't humor. This was fear. My fingers tightened around the notebook. A cold breath of wind slid through the open door behind me, making me shiver. I turned instinctively, half expecting to see, of course, no one. Still, the weight of the silence was different now. The air inside Erebus felt heavier. I told myself I didn't believe in superstitions, that there was always a logical explanation, but I also wasn't an idiot. I needed to check the station logs, find out what happened to the crew. Maybe this was some elaborate prank, or maybe something else entirely. I flipped to the back of the handbook, searching for more notes. But the pages beyond the rules were blank. Only that last sentence lingered in my mind. I shut the notebook and exhaled. The overhead lights flickered. Just bad wiring. Just bad wiring. But suddenly, 6 weeks at Erebus Station felt like a very long time. I spent most of my first evening at Erebus checking the station. It was exactly as I had feared, empty, eerily untouched, as if the crew had walked out mid-task and never returned. Every desk still had scattered documents, every bunk had signs of recent use, and yet there was no one. No logs explaining where they had gone. No distress calls left behind. Just an abandoned station and a strange, unsettling rulebook I couldn't get out of my head. By the time I settled into my assigned quarters, exhaustion pulled at me, but sleep felt like a distant thing. The cot was stiff, the air stale, and the silence too deep. I glanced at my watch. 11:40 p.m. I wasn't ready to sleep yet. I grabbed the handbook again, flipping through its pages in the dim light. My eyes landed on a familiar line. If you hear knocking after midnight, ignore it. There is nothing outside. A nervous chuckle escaped me. Right. Nothing outside. It was just old station paranoia, probably something passed down from shift to shift as a joke. Maybe an old scare tactic, like campfire stories meant to keep rookies on edge. Still, I found myself glancing at the door. 11:50 p.m. The temperature inside had dropped slightly, a whisper of cold air brushing against my arms. I pulled my jacket closer and checked the heating system, still running, but weaker than it should have been. Another thing to add to my growing list of maintenance issues. Outside the window, the floodlights cast long, pale beams over the snow-covered ground. The surrounding woods loomed in the distance, dark and still, like a wall of shadow pressing in around the station. I set the handbook down and rubbed my face. Maybe I'd been overthinking everything. Maybe, if I just got some sleep, knock, knock, knock. My breath caught. 11:58 p.m. I froze. The knocks were slow, deliberate, and right outside my door. I hadn't imagined it. I forced myself to stay still, my pulse hammering against my ribs. It had to be the wind, the station settling, some stupid trick of acoustics. Knock, 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 a steady, patient rhythm. I swallowed hard. It wasn't possible. No one else was here. I glanced at the notebook, its warning replaying in my mind. Ignore it. There is nothing outside. I clenched my jaw, my body screaming at me to move, to check, to do something, but I didn't. I sat in silence, gripping the edges of my cot, waiting. The knocking continued for exactly 2 minutes, then stopped. The quiet that followed was worse. The air felt heavier, the room colder. I strained my ears, listening for footsteps, for anything, but there was nothing. And then, a sharp creak, not from the door, from the window. I turned, my heart in my throat. The window by my bunk, the one I had personally locked earlier that evening, was open. The curtains barely stirred, the wind too weak to have forced it. My stomach twisted. I stood slowly, every muscle in my body tight, and reached for the flashlight on my belt. Clicking it on, I stepped toward the window, pulse hammering. The snow outside was undisturbed, except for one thing: footprints. They started at the tree line and led directly to the station. But there were no footprints leading away. I scanned the area, the beam of my flashlight shaking slightly. Nothing moved, no signs of life, no person who could have made them. A deep, instinctive dread settled in my chest. I backed away from the window and reached for the handbook, flipping to the last page where that single, desperate warning was scrawled. They know when you don't. I shut the book with trembling fingers. Then, slowly, carefully, I locked the window again. I didn't check outside, I didn't answer the door, and for the rest of the night, I didn't sleep. Not really. I spent the night lying on the stiff cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound in the station, every shift in the metal walls, every groan of the wind, every phantom noise I tried to tell myself wasn't real. The handbook sat on the table beside me, its pages burned into my memory. There is nothing outside. They know when you don't. And yet there had been footprints in the snow, footprints that didn't lead away. By the time the first hint of morning bled through the station's narrow windows, I felt the exhaustion in my bones. But something else had settled in too, something heavier, something close to fear. I found them in the control room, huddled over the flickering screens. The station was old, its monitors barely holding onto life, the static hum of failing machinery filling the stale air. The first one to turn to me was a thin, sharp-featured man with graying hair and cold eyes. His uniform was clean, pristine even, but something about him felt off, too still, too controlled, like a man who knew something I didn't. Cale, station manager. The second was younger, maybe early 30s, with tired eyes and grease-streaked hands. He looked like someone who had been here too long, like someone who had seen too much. Bren, technician. They were the only two left. "You're alive," Bren muttered, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to shake off a chill. I frowned. "Should I not be?" Cale's expression didn't change. "Did you follow the rules?" The question landed like a brick in my stomach. I thought about the knocking, the window, the footprints. I thought about the moment I had stood there, my hand inches from the glass, debating whether I should look outside. I nodded. Yeah, I did. For the first time, Cale relaxed slightly, his shoulders losing the rigid tension they had held. He turned back to the monitors, scanning the distorted images of empty hallways and static-filled feeds. "Good," he said, "then you'll last a little longer." The way he said it unnerved me. I took a step closer. "What the hell is going on here?" Silence. Cale didn't look at me. Bren sighed and leaned against the desk. "It's exactly what it looks like, man. This place is screwed." He gestured toward one of the cameras. "People vanish. People go insane. People break the rules and—" He hesitated. "And they don't get another chance." I folded my arms. "And the rules? You really expect me to believe that following some creepy handbook is the only thing keeping us alive?" Bren's jaw tensed. "Every rule in that book has a reason." Cale finally turned to face me, his cold eyes studying me like I was a puzzle he was trying to solve. "The last guy in your position," he said slowly, "he broke a rule." Something in his tone made my skin prickle. I swallowed. "Which rule?" Cale's gaze didn't waver. He opened the door. The room felt colder. I glanced at Bren, half expecting him to laugh, to say this was a joke, some kind of twisted initiation for the new guy, but his expression was unreadable. "What happened to him?" I asked. Cale didn't blink. "He's not here anymore." I waited for more, but that was it. No explanation, no body, just gone. I clenched my fists. "I need a real answer." Cale tilted his head slightly. "No, you need to follow the rules." I exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling up. "So that's it? Just blind obedience? No answers?" Cale leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You want answers?" His tone was calm, almost sympathetic. "Then survive long enough to get them." I stared at him. Bren rubbed his temples. Look, man, I know this is insane. I know how it sounds, but trust me, you don't want to find out what happens when you break the rules. I wanted to argue. I wanted to demand proof, demand some real explanation instead of these cryptic warnings. But the memory of last night lingered in my mind. The knocking, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. Maybe I didn't believe in superstition, but I wasn't stupid. Fine, I said. I'll follow the damn rules. For now. I ran. My feet pounded against the tile floor of the terminal, my breath ragged as I tore through the empty concourse. The ID badge in my hand felt heavier than it should, like it carried something far worse than just my name. The air around me had changed. The airport no longer felt like an airport. The ceilings loomed taller, the shadows stretched unnaturally long, the fluorescent lights overhead flickered like they were gasping for air. And then I saw it. The mural. I had passed it 100 times before, a massive painted wall near the center of the terminal. It had always been there, some generic depiction of unity, of travel, a piece of meaningless airport art that no one really looked at. But now it was different. I skidded to a stop, my chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. My eyes locked onto the center of the mural, my stomach dropping into a bottomless void. Bill was in the painting, not just his likeness. It was him, frozen mid-scream, his face contorted in terror, his hands pressed against some unseen barrier as if he had been trapped inside the paint itself. His eyes, wild, desperate, seemed to be looking directly at me. And beneath him, scrawled in uneven, jagged letters, was a single sentence. "You are next." A shudder ripped through me, every nerve screaming at me to run. I stumbled back, shaking my head, my mind refusing to accept what I was seeing. I turned and bolted down the hallway, my only thought to get away, to find somewhere, anywhere, to hide. The nearest door was a restroom. I shoved my way inside, my breath coming in sharp gasps. For a moment, I let myself believe I was safe. Then I saw him, the janitor. He was standing in the middle of the tiled floor, a mop in his hands. But he wasn't mopping. He was just going through the motions. His hands slid the mop back and forth over the floor, but the mop head never actually touched the ground. It hovered an inch above the surface, swaying rhythmically. And he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at my reflection. I froze, my stomach tightening into a painful knot. The man's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. Then, slowly, he turned his head all the way around. The rest of his body didn't move, just his head, twisting at an impossible angle until his two wide eyes were locked onto mine. And when he spoke, his voice wasn't human. It was a rasp, a whisper, a thing trying to imitate speech. "Mike, where's the gate?" A jolt of horror shot through me, and I stumbled backward. My shoulder slammed into the bathroom stall, my breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I spun on my heel and sprinted for the door. The janitor didn't chase me. But as I fled, his voice followed, curling around me like smoke, slipping into my ears with a tone too knowing, too eager. "You can't run forever, Mike." I didn't stop. I burst out of the restroom, my legs moving before my mind could even process what had just happened. My only thought was to get back to the break room, to get somewhere familiar, somewhere safe, if such a place even existed anymore. The airport was shifting. I could feel it in my bones. The air felt thicker, heavier, like I was moving through something unseen. The lights above me flickered violently, casting long, warped shadows that stretched unnaturally across the floor. And the mural. I didn't dare look at it again as I ran past. I reached the break room, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the door. The second I was inside, I slammed it shut behind me, locking it with trembling fingers. I pressed my back against the wood, my chest heaving, sweat dripping down my spine. For a long moment there was silence, then a single knock, and a voice, smooth, patient, amused. "Mike, where is the gate?" The day passed in a blur of unease. I spent most of it roaming the station, checking rooms that hadn't been touched in days, searching for something, anything, that might tell me what had happened here. But Erebus gave me nothing. Only silence. Only empty spaces that felt like they had just barely been abandoned. Every so often, I caught Bren watching me like he was waiting for me to ask more questions, like he expected me to keep pushing. And Kale? Kale knew. He knew far more than he was letting on, but he never offered answers, just warnings, just reminders to follow the rules. By the time night fell, I felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. I didn't know how long I could keep this up. 11:50 p.m. I sat in the control room, flipping absently through the station handbook while the monitors buzzed softly in front of me. Kale was somewhere else, doing whatever it was he did when he wasn't watching me. Bren had turned in early, mumbling something about needing sleep while he still could. That left me alone with the security feeds, watching empty hallways and dead monitors flickering static. And then one of the cameras glitched. I frowned, leaning forward. The feed flickered, static, warping the image for a moment before clearing. It was the eastern hallway. And I wasn't alone. A shadow crawled into view. I stiffened, my pulse spiking. It wasn't walking, it was crawling, its limbs moving wrong, its shape twisting unnaturally as it dragged itself along the corridor. The camera feed wavered again. I watched, heart hammering, as the shadow moved toward the edge of the frame, toward the camera's blind spot, and then it stopped, right at the point where the camera couldn't see, like it knew, like it understood exactly where to hide. I felt a cold sweat break out along the back of my neck. The handbook's warnings flashed through my mind. If the cameras show something moving where it shouldn't be, do not investigate. I swallowed hard. My instincts screamed at me to go check, to see if there was something actually out there. But before I could make that choice, the alarm went off. A test of the rules. The sirens blared, the red emergency lights flashing across the monitors. I jolted up, hands gripping the edge of the desk as the station shook with the sound. I scanned the screens, heart racing, looking for a fire, a breach, something that explained the alarm. But there was nothing. No movement, no structural failure, no reason. I inhaled sharply, forcing myself to think. And then I remembered the rule book. If the alarm sounds with no clear threat, do not leave your position. This was a trick. A cold, creeping dread coiled around my spine. I stayed frozen, hands clenched into fists. I could feel my own pulse pounding in my skull, my instincts screaming at me to do something, but I didn't move. The sirens blared for 3 more minutes. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, silence. The red lights stopped flashing. The station fell still. I let out a slow breath, my fingers aching from how tightly I had been gripping the desk. I had done the right thing. I had followed the rule. And then, knock, knock, knock. A sharp, deliberate sound from the control room door. I went still. My eyes darted to the monitors, scanning for movement. The eastern hallway camera was still frozen, stuck on its last clear image of an empty corridor. But I knew better. Something was out there. Something was knocking. I turned my gaze to the door. The metal surface looked ordinary, no strange shadows beneath it, no whisper of movement from the other side. Just a door. And the knocking continued. I reached out. My hand hovered inches from the handle, hesitation warring with curiosity. Maybe it was Kale. Maybe it was Bren. Maybe... The radio on my belt crackled to life. Kale's voice came through, low and sharp. "Don't open it." I flinched. My fingers jerked away from the handle. My breath came faster now. "Kale?" I muttered into the radio. A pause. Then, "It's not me." The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was thick, pressing against me like a weight. I took a slow step back, my pulse thundering in my ears. For a long, awful moment, I just stood there, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. No more knocks, No voice calling out from the other side, just the feeling that something had been there and had left once it knew I wouldn't answer. I exhaled shakily, gripping the radio tighter. What the hell is going on here? There was another long pause. Then Cale's voice, quieter now. You followed the rule. A pause. That's why you're still here. I spent the next day in a haze of exhaustion. Even after the events of the previous night, the alarm that meant nothing, the knocking at the door, and Cale's warning, there were no answers. Only silence. Cale and Bren acted as if nothing had happened. No one talked about the thing in the eastern hallway. No one mentioned why the alarm had gone off or who or what had knocked on the control room door. And I didn't ask, because I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. That night I was alone again. The control room monitors flickered weakly, displaying grainy footage of empty hallways and still lifeless rooms. I checked my watch. 2:37 a.m. Another night in this goddamn place. Bren had turned in hours ago, and Cale was, wherever Cale went, when he disappeared for long stretches of time. That left just me, watching the station, following the rules. A low static hum filled the air from the radio on my belt. I adjusted my chair, trying to fight the creeping fatigue. My head dipped forward for only a second. Then the radio crackled, and I heard my own voice. Cale, Bren, open the door. It's me. It's Miles. The breath left my lungs. I froze. The voice on the radio was identical to mine, not just similar, perfectly exact. Like a recording, like something that had been studying me. I grabbed the radio, fingers clenched so tightly they ached. The voice spoke again. Open the door. Silence. Then the distortion started, a horrible, wet, garbled sound, like someone trying to speak through a mouthful of broken glass. The voice twisted, warping until it barely sounded human anymore. And then it spoke again, not as me, as something else. I'm already inside. And then the lights went out. The station was swallowed in an instant. Not just darkness, but something heavier, something thick and unnatural. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the switch. The second it clicked on, I swung the beam across the room. Nothing. The control room looked the same. The static-filled monitors were now blank. Dead screens, reflecting the weak glow of my flashlight. Then I heard it. A sound that made my stomach turn. A long scraping noise, like claws dragging against metal. It came from the walls. The sound was slow, deliberate, moving along the station's surface as if something was feeling its way through. I held my breath, forcing myself not to move. Then the noise stopped, and I saw it, or rather, I saw the absence of it. In the farthest corner of the control room, just beyond the reach of my flashlight's beam, there was a hole. Not a normal hole, not a shadow. Something else. A perfect void, a patch of nothingness that swallowed the space around it. The light from my flashlight didn't illuminate it. It didn't cast a shadow. It didn't reflect. Because it wasn't darkness. It was an absence, a hole in reality itself. And it was watching me. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The hole, the thing, remained still, its presence pressing against my skin like a weight. I felt its attention on me. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't my mind playing tricks. It was there. And then it shifted. The hole moved, crawling across the floor with a slow, unnatural glide, like liquid sliding over an invisible surface. My stomach clenched. I took an involuntary step backward, gripping my flashlight like it was a weapon. The thing paused. Then, for the first time, I stared directly into it, and it recoiled. The moment my eyes locked onto it, the void shrank, pulling away like a living thing retreating from a predator. It didn't like being seen. My heart pounded. The thing hesitated, hovering near the edge of the room, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. Then, inch by inch, it retreated, folding into itself, pulling back toward the corner, shrinking until it disappeared completely. I stood there, flashlight trembling in my grip, waiting for something else to happen. But there was only silence. The lights flickered, then snapped back on, flooding the room in a harsh white glow. The monitors buzzed back to life, the radio on my belt silent once more. As if nothing had happened, but I knew better. I had seen it. And it had seen me, too. The next morning, we gathered in the control room. I hadn't slept. None of us had. The thing had changed. It wasn't just haunting us anymore. It was testing us. Testing the rules. Seeing which ones could be broken. Bren sat at the control desk, dark circles under his eyes, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Cale stood by the monitors, watching the static-filled feeds like he was waiting for something to move. I leaned against the table, rubbing my temples. "We've been thinking about the rules all wrong," I said finally. "We thought they were just to protect us." I looked at both of them. "But what if they're not just for us? What if they're for it?" Bren frowned. "What do you mean?" I exhaled. "The rules don't just keep us safe, they keep it contained." Silence. Cale nodded slowly, as if the thought had been lingering in his mind, unspoken. "It's not just trying to break in," I continued. "It's trying to break out." Bren let out a breath. "That thing in the control room last night, it wasn't just watching you. It was trying to see what it could get away with." "And it's learning," I muttered. A heavy silence settled over us. Finally, Cale spoke. "If it wants to break the rules," he said, his voice eerily calm, "then we'll use the rules to trap it again." The plan was simple on paper, terrifying in reality. We were going to force it back to the eastern hallway, the place it had first appeared. We didn't know if it had been sealed there before, but we knew it didn't like the rules, and that was our weapon. The hallway was lined with reinforced security doors. If we could corner it, we could seal it inside, just like before. "We need to make it angry," I said. "Force it into one place." Cale gave me a knowing look. "Then we start with the rules." We moved quickly. 2 a.m. Bren and Cale stood near the eastern hallway, floodlights at the ready. The plan was simple. I would draw it out, force it to react, and drive it back toward them. I gripped the station handbook, heart hammering in my chest. Then I spoke the first rule aloud. "No opening windows after 10 p.m. A scream tore through the station, not human, not animal, something in between. The walls shuddered as if the station itself had heard me. From the far side of the hall, the shadows twisted. A shape unfolded from nothing, a darkness that wasn't just absence, it was hunger, it was listening. I gritted my teeth and took a step forward. No turning off the floodlights. The thing recoiled, its formless shape rippling like it was being pushed back. The overhead lights flickered violently, but they stayed on. It didn't like that. "It's working," Bren shouted. Cale nodded sharply. "Keep going." The shadows coiled around the walls, the air growing thick, heavy, as if the station itself was suffocating. The thing lurched toward me. I stepped forward, holding the handbook in front of me like a shield. "Do not answer the knocking after midnight." A violent, distorted howl filled the air. The shadows pulled away, twisting in agony. It hated the rules, because the rules made it weak. We had one shot. As it retreated, writhing and twisting back into the eastern hallway, Cale and Bren moved fast, slamming the reinforced door shut. But it wasn't enough. The thing fought back, pressing against the door from the other side, trying to break free. I grabbed a marker from my pocket, heart racing, and wrote the words directly onto the door, "Do not open." The walls shook violently. The air around us rippled, the station groaning like it was alive. Then the thing screamed, a horrible, inhuman wail, a sound like metal tearing apart, like something being dragged into a void against its will. The door buckled inward and then slammed shut. The The station fell silent, no more flickering lights, no more twisting shadows, just the quiet hum of the station's systems coming back to life. It was over. Bren exhaled shakily. Holy shit. I stared at the sealed door, heart pounding in my ears. The words I had written were still there, bold and clear. The rules held it back. Cale stepped forward, pressing a hand to the cold metal surface. His voice was quiet. It's trapped again. I let out a slow breath, gripping the handbook tightly. For how long? I asked. Cale didn't answer, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The station felt different after that night. The air was lighter, the silence no longer suffocating. The cameras stopped glitching. The radios stayed silent. The rules had worked. We had used them not just to survive, but to fight back. But as I sat in the control room the next night, watching the empty hallways, I couldn't shake the feeling in my gut. The thing had been testing us, and it had learned something new. I glanced at the station handbook, flipping to the back page where the final note had once been scrawled. They know when you don't. I pulled out my pen and added my own note beneath it. But now we know too. The station shut down a week later. None of us were surprised. After what had happened, after what we had seen, there was no way they could keep Erebus running. Not safely, not anymore. The official reason was structural concerns. That's what they put in the report. No mention of the thing we had trapped. No mention of the rules that weren't just rules, but a cage. They buried it. Pretended it was just another failing research outpost, nothing unusual, but we knew better. On our last day at Erebus, the security team arrived. Not military, not government, private contractors. They came in quietly, no insignia, no names. Just men in black tactical gear with blank expressions, setting up new surveillance equipment, reinforcing sections of the station we knew had already been sealed. They weren't here to study it. They were here to contain it, or worse, to use it. We watched from the landing pad as they moved in. No questions, no explanations, just a new order taking control of something they barely understood. And as our shuttle lifted off, I saw it one last time. The eastern hallway door, still shut, still marked with the words I had scrawled across its surface, "Do not open." I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. We were given debriefings after we left. Nothing official, just polite threats disguised as company policy. This stays classified. You will not discuss the events at Erebus. If asked, you will refer to it as a structural failure incident. You will move on. Move on, like any of us could just forget. Bren left first. He didn't even wait for the final paycheck, just packed his things and disappeared. I heard he moved somewhere warm, far from snow, far from places with empty hallways and flickering lights. Cale was different. He didn't run. He just watched. And I knew. He was waiting. A month passed, then two, no official updates, no reports. Erebus was still off the grid, wiped from active research sites. No one talked about it, but then, late one night, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something in my gut told me to pick up. I pressed the phone to my ear. Silence. Then, a faint, distorted sound crackled through the speaker. A sound like metal dragging against metal, like claws on a station wall. And then, through the static, a voice. Miles, open the door. I hung up, but I didn't sleep that night because I knew the truth. The station might be shut down, the doors might be sealed, but it wasn't gone. It was just waiting.